Hello and welcome back to another video of Company of Heroes 2, in which I'm going to talk about the historical backgrounds of the units that are in game. Today we're going to talk about the Red Army, the units of the Soviet Union. Of course, this army is called the Red Army because of the Bolsheviks taking over in 1917. And they were taking over and sending away the government. They just took them prisoner, and when they took over power, then a civil war broke out. The Bolsheviks were one party and all their opponents were the other side, fighting against them. In this war, the Bolsheviks were called the Reds, and the other ones the whites. So it was red versus white, and because the Reds won and they used an army in that war, that army was called the Red Army. Also, red was the primary color in socialism, so that all fit the scheme. Today we are going to talk about the units, and again I will start with the base units that you get in the T0 building. So we start with the engineers, and the engineers, they are over here. Here we can see the engineers next to the base building, and the engineers, they are a 4-man squad, and actually the engineers are a bit of a combination between various engineer units which were in the Red Army. There were regular sappers, there were mine engineer units, there were assault sappers, there were motorized sappers, and they all had different tasks. Right here you can see that this is the winter uniform, so the engineers are wearing the telogreika, which is these padded vest, and the engineers in this game are a bit of a mix between the regular sapper units and the assault sapper units, and also the mining engineers, because they can lay the TM35 mine, which you can see here, which is an anti-vehicle mine. They can also plant demolition charges, which is sometimes part of construction, because you have to blow up stuff in order to create defensive positions, for example, and then that is part of the normal regular sapper brigade. But they can be upgraded with the ROX 3 flamethrower. And let's do that for a bit. If you take a closer look, you can see that the flamethrower thing looks like a regular rifle. This is inherited from the ROX 2 flamethrower. The ROX 2 flamethrower was a flamethrower designed to deceive the enemy. The enemy was usually looking for flamethrower guys in the opponent's units, and then they were picking them out to destroy them first, because the flamethrower was an extremely dangerous weapon, of course. So while the enemy was looking for the flamethrower, the Soviets were making it hard for them, and they disguised the fuel tanks on the back as some sort of a backpack. This practice was abandoned while the ROX 3 flamethrower was developed, and this is why you can see the tank pretty clearly on the back. But another way to deceive the enemy was that the flamethrower weapon itself was an imitation of a rifle, and that was kept in the ROX 3 design. So that's why it looks like this guy is holding a rifle with a flame on the end. The fact that they have a flamethrower and can upgrade to it is a sign that they might be assault sappers, which were called Shizbr units. And the Shizbr unit is it's also a Russian, of course, and I don't speak Russian, so I can't really explain every word in the Russian terms. But the Shizbr units They were assault engineer sapper brigades of the High Command Reserve. And this is about what Uuurrraaahhh means, the official name of the unit. They were heavily armed, and they were also part of the shock armies, and I will talk about the shock armies later. And they were also wearing steel plates, the steel bibs that were later becoming famous by certain pictures that were published after some sessions with soldiers wearing them, and also some action pictures of those. But these units here, they don't wear the steel bib, so that's why you can see that they are a mixture of various types of engineer units. I'll go talk about the steel bib later when we come to the shock troops. So this concludes the story about the engineers. So let's go to the conscript unit, which is over here, also wearing telogreikas. They have the blanket over their shoulder, which is typical for Red Army soldiers. They also have the standard issue helmets, and they are armed with the Mosin Nagant rifle. The Mosin Nagant is the normal rifle for conscript soldiers. It was the most common rifle in the Red Army. And if you are checking it out, then you will notice that the Mosin Nagant is the most produced bolt action rifle in the Second World War. In total, almost 40 million were produced, and only the AK-47 is a weapon that was mass produced with even bigger numbers. The Mosin Nagant had various variations, but the one which is used by most conscript soldiers is the M1891-30, and the Mosin Nagant is is that common that all soldiers did have one. In Company of Heroes, in the campaign, the suggestion is made that the Russians didn't have enough weapons, because the campaign is sort of based off the movie Enemy at the Gates. But and in Enemy at the Gates, as you might know, the opening scene has the soldiers running, and only one gets a rifle and the other one only gets bullets. And this is a myth. It's untrue that the Red Army was short of weapons in the Second World War. What is true is that they were short of weapon in the First World War, when about 4 out of 6 soldiers had a weapon. But they learned from this experience. They also had the Civil War afterwards, in which a whole bunch of weapons got destroyed, of course. So they mass-produced more and more weapons in the 30s, especially after the takeover of the Nazis in Germany. The Soviet Union was not like, the Nazis are arresting all communists in Germany, let's do nothing. So they actually were preparing for a war. Another myth about the Red Army is that they were totally surprised by Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, which is also not true. What is true, though, is that the troops got overrun because the Stavka, the Soviet High Command, they didn't expect the Germans to attack after 15th of May. Because if the Germans would attack after the 15th of May, they would run out of time before the temperatures in the Soviet Union would drop, and then they would have a problem, and they would not be able to recover from those problems. As history turns out, that was true. So the myth about the Red Army not having any weapons is only created by the Hollywood movie of Enemy at the Gates, which has several mistakes about the Battle of Stalingrad, but this is one of the most obnoxious myths which is still surrounding the Red Army, and that's a bit sad, because the Red Army really deserves a bit better than just being a ragtag bunch of soldiers who don't have any experience and don't even have a rifle for each soldier. Okay, so about the helmet. The helmet was there were various iterations of the helmet, but the first one looked like the French one. It was some sort of the Adrian helmet, like the French had in their arsenal. Afterwards, the Soviet soldiers they got new helmets, which were called the SSH 36, and some new iterations were designed up until the SSH 40. This one that you can see here is one of those later designs, and this is an SSH 40, I guess. Because of course in-game most units represent late war soldiers, they don't have the Adrian helmets anymore. Only very early pictures in World War II show these soldiers with Adrian helmets, except for example pictures of the Red Army soldiers greeting the Germans in Poland after the signing of the Non-Aggression Pact and the invasion of Poland. Okay, the equipment of the Red Army soldier was pretty standard. We can see here canteens, bags, and some pouches for Moshin Nagant ammo, which is enough for the Soviet soldier to survive for a pretty long time. And also the Telogreika has a part which is covering the neck, and this also could be worn over the back of the head, which prevented the Soviet soldier to freeze in winter time. This was a big advantage over the Germans, who had a steel cap in their neck, which when it froze would make their neck freeze and their bodily temperature drop below comfortable temperatures. Well, as you can see, the conscript unit has 6 men, 6 models, and in an upcoming match this will be increased to 7, because the Company of Heroes 2 is emphasizing on huge manpower for the Soviets with big units and big crews, and that's also because they are emphasizing that myth about the Soviet Union having loads of men and not so many weapons, which again, I can't emphasize that enough, is false. These are called conscripts. Conscription was, as in most countries, it was from 18 to about 40, and in 1944 the age of conscription was lowered to 17, because they were being short of men after the war had taken so many lives, and by lowering the standard age for conscription with 1 year, they doubled the amount of available men for conscription, which saved their asses in some parts of the war. Okay, so that concludes our story about the conscripts. Let's go to the T1 units. we have here the Penal Battalion. The Penal Battalion is a very weird unit, and it's also surrounded with a bunch of myths. The Penal Battalion is it will say that it is, one of the voice lines is Strafniki are ready to die, or Strafbat needs orders. And Strafbat is the actual name of the Penal Battalion in Russian. The Strafbat was, well, it's a battalion, of course, and 6 men is by and large not a battalion. And these penal guys, they were guys who had misbehaved, or they had shown cowardice in the face of the enemy. I'll continue about the equipment later, but let's first take a look at why they are being punished. In the description here it says that they are independent thinkers, vicious criminals, hardened troops serving time for minor offenses, but actually most of the penal battalions were they consisted of officers who didn't carry out their orders in the way that Stavka had envisioned it. So in the first phases of the war, in the opening year of Operation Barbarossa, the Red Army had to retreat a whole lot of times. They were encircled by the Germans, there were Kesselschlachten, and the Red Army soldiers were surrendering in their thousands. This made the Red Army look bad. The Soviet Union looked weak. So Stavka came with Order 227. And Order number 227 is the not one step back order. It's pretty well known. It's also portrayed in the campaign in Company of Heroes 2, but again it's portrayed falsely. What you get in the game is that there's an officer standing next to your T0 building. It shoots every retreating soldier within a certain amount of time. That's totally untrue. Shooting your own troops in wartime is really dumb to do, because you need those soldiers to fight the enemy. So you're not going to shoot your own soldiers because they retreat. What is true about Order 227 is that it was needed to motivate officers to retreat against the orders of the High Command. So if the High Command ordered an attack, then the officers who were just ignoring that order, they were being apprehended, and they were put in the penal battalions. There were of course also conscripts in the penal battalions, but those were just arrested for normal misdemeanor, and they were arrested by NKVD officials who were functioning as military police. So I'm coming back to the movie Enemy at the Gates. In the movie Enemy at the Gates, you can see Order 227 being carried out in a very wrong way. You can see that they are shooting retreating soldiers because they are being mown down by German machine gun fire, and the soldiers are being mown down by so-called blocking troops. Blocking troops were not MGs setting up and then mowing down their own soldiers. Blocking troops were exactly they were army units that were just watching the rear of the attacking units to prevent enemies to infiltrate from the rear, to apprehend suspicious persons, and to send back retreating guys unless there was an order for a retreat. So the Order 227, as it was being known later, was not as harsh as they were portrayed in outside of Russia. So penal battalions were large army units. They were used for clearing minefields. They were used for well, the dirty work, and they were led by conscripts who were not convicted most of the time, and that was also part of the punishment, because most convicted guys were NCOs, and now they had to listen to a soldier which was lower in rank. Okay, onto the equipment. On the head of these penal guys there's the Soviet Ushanka. It's a woolen hat, and the flaps can be loosened, and then they can be tied again under the chin, and then you have a very, very warm head, neck and face. I own one of these myself, and I can speak from experience that you won't have any cold moments when wearing such a woolen hat. The weapon that the penal battalions are carrying is the SVT-40. The SVT-40 is a semi-automatic weapon, and the SVT-40 is actually a pretty good weapon and a bit more advanced than the Moshin Nagant. It's the SVT means Samozaryadnaya Vintovka Tokarev, which means that it's the self-loading rifle of Tokarev. Tokarev was the designer, and this weapon is designed to have a bullet being fired, and then the energy is used to put a new bullet in the chamber. The range of the SVT is a bit lower than the Moshin Nagant, but the reloading system was advanced enough for the Germans to copy it over for their Gewehr 43, which I talked about in my first video, which was about the Wehrmacht. Okay, so these guys can upgrade with PTRS anti-tank rifles, but I'll talk about them with the guard units, which we will pay a visit right now. Here are the guard rifle infantry units. The guard rifles, they are special armies. The armies of the guard rifles were used on various fronts, and there were special guard armies, and there were in total a number of 11 guard armies. The guards armies were fighting in several famous battles. The 1st, 2nd and 8th guard armies were fighting in Stalingrad. The 3rd, the 5th and the 8th were fighting in the Battle of Berlin. The 4th, the 5th, the 6th and the 7th guard rifle army were fighting in the Battle of Kursk, and the 6th, the 8th and the 11th guard rifle army were fighting in Operation Bagration, and the 9th Guard Army was fighting at the Ukrainian front. They were not taking part in really famous battles, but that's because they were only formed in January 1945, which was pretty late for the Second World War, of course. And the 10th Guard Army was fighting at the Leningrad front. The most famous guard army maybe is the 5th one, because they were fighting not only at Kursk and Berlin, but they were also the guys who were meeting up with the Americans at the broken bridge in Torgau on the Elbe. That's why they are on the most famous pictures of World War II. The guards are armed with the PTRS-41. The PTRS is the Protivotankovoye Ruzhyo Simonova, which means the Simonov anti-tank rifle. Simonov was the designer, and this anti-tank rifle is it's actually a pretty heavy weapon, And as you can see here, this guy is carrying it by himself, which is by far not easy. To carry it and quickly and to set it up, you actually need two guys. But these guards in Company of Heroes, they are superheroes, and they can just shoulder this weapon and fire it standing, which is pretty much impossible in real life, and at least it's not very accurate. The other guys are armed with Mojina guns, but you can upgrade them with the DP light machine gun. And who's the lucky bastard who got it? Okay, here. The DP-28 is a light machine gun, and it has a circular magazine, as you can see here. It has a bipod underneath, and the DP-28 is one of the most common light machine guns in the Soviet army. DP means Degtyaryova Pechotny, which means Degtyaryov's infantry machine gun, and it was designed in the 20s, and it was used throughout the Second World War, and almost 800,000 were produced. The guards in Company of Heroes have the button vehicle option, and that means that the machine gun shatters vehicle vision blocks, reducing movement speed and rate of fire. This is pretty realistic, because the Germans were using vision blocks, which means that in the vision slits of tanks and light vehicles there were vision blocks. They were some sort of glass blocks that were meant to stop bullets. Otherwise the vision slit would be open, and apart from unsafe, that would be also very uncomfortable, because that would mean that the driver would be with his face out in the open while driving, which then would make his eyes tear, and then he could not see properly, so vision blocks were to prevent all that. But if you shatter the vision block, the driver can't see anything anymore, so that's how the vehicle got buttoned. They also have the RGD-33 fragmentation grenade, and the RGD-33 fragmentation grenade is a normal anti-personnel grenade. It was a pretty complex grenade to produce, and that's why it was not mass produced, and it was replaced by several other grenades, which we will talk about when we go to the shock troops. Which reminds me, I forgot something about the conscripts, because they can be upgraded with Molotov and anti-tank RPG anti-tank grenades. And the RPG-43 is a real anti-tank grenade. It could several of these could disable light vehicles. Heavy tanks were not really vulnerable to these. But the Molotov cocktail, let's do the animation because it's a fan favorite. The animation is really long, and what you can see here is that the guy is just taking out a petrol bomb from his backpack, and he just throws it. And he also has a very short animation in which he seems to light it. This petrol bomb is, of course, it's called the Molotov cocktail because it was actually first used in the war against Finland. But the Finns, they didn't call it this at first. It was designed to with bottles, so that's what we see here. This is a bottle, and it has a liquid which can burn over a vehicle, and actually the first time it was used was not in the Finnish War but in the Spanish Civil War, but the Finns copied it from there, and they invented the nickname Molotov cocktail because they were the joke was that the Molotov cocktail was to drink together with the packages of food, and the packages of food were the nickname for the Soviet bombs that were sent by the Soviet artillery in the Winter War in 1939-1940. While the Soviets were blasting the Finns, Molotov said that they were not bombing the Finns, but they were giving them humanitarian aid in the form of food. So the Finns mocked that statement by Molotov by naming the petrol bomb after him. Okay, back to the guards. So these are the regular guards, and there's also the assault guards. They are here, and the assault guards, they have some SVT-40s and some Pepeshka 41s. The Pepeshka is a submachine gun, and as you might notice, the 41 is the year in which it was produced, and the Pepeshka is one of the most produced weapons in the Red Army. Pepeshka it's called Pistolet Pulemyot Shpagina, and it's officially called Automat because it was an automatic carabine, model 1941. And it was the alternative for the PPD-40, which was expensive, and the Pepeshka was much easier to mass produce. It had a wooden stock, and it had round magazines. There were also coffin magazines later, but this one has round magazines, and it was in use from 1941 till much after the war. There were the circular magazines had 71 bullets in them, and the coffin magazines had 35 shots. I'm not sure how many were produced really, but it must have been like 6 million, 7 million of those, and as the Mosin Nagant was the most produced bolt-action rifle, this was the most produced submachine gun. Okay, which is a nice bridge to the shock troops. The shock troops are here, and they are also armed with the Pepeshka submachine guns, but here we can see the steel bibs. The steel bibs are on the body of the shock troop soldier. Look at me, come on. Yeah, good. The shock troop soldier is wearing a steel bib, which means that he has extra armor compared to regular soldiers. The steel bib was designed to stop bullets, light caliber bullets, and it was designed as some kind of a cuirass, a body armor, similar to some body armor that was used in the trenches in First World War, and similar to medieval cuirasses used by knights. This steel bib was 2 millimeters thick, and the meaning of it was that it was meant to stop light caliber bullets, like I said, and also shrapnel from artillery. It's called the SN-24, and SN stands for Stalnoy Nagrudnik, which means steel breastplate. Oh, I said 24, but I meant 42. So that was in the Second World War. They used these steel breastplates in, especially in some of the shock armies. I talked about guards armies before, and there were also shock armies. And the shock armies were, well, they were derived from the Stoßtruppen, the German invention from the First World War. And the shock armies were meant to do a breakthrough at a certain point in the lines, in the front line. So whereas the German doctrine was centered around checking out weaknesses in the line and exploiting those with speed, the Blitzkrieg, the shock army doctrine was just designed around massing infantry in one place where you have a large majority over the enemy and then just push through, just wear the enemy down at that point, and the shock armies were used for that objective. The first shock army was active in the Moscow and Leningrad fronts, and on the northern fronts in the later part of the war, the Baltic front and the Vistula front. The second shock army was fighting in the Leningrad siege, and they were also on the Vistula front, so in Poland. The third shock army was fighting in the Battle of Berlin, and also active in the Baltic and the Polish fronts. The fourth shock army was taking part in Operation Bagration, which was in Belorussia for most of the time, and therefore they were part of the Belarusian front. And the fifth shock army is, probably the most famous one, because it was fighting in Stalingrad and also in Berlin. So they were fighting in the big turning point of the Eastern Front and in the final battle in Berlin. And in the meantime, they were fighting on the Polish front. Okay, the shock army has the RG-42 grenade, which is the successor of the RGD-33. It was not really a successor, but because the RGD-33 was difficult to produce and the RG-42 was much simpler, they were mass producing these and could supply the troops much easier with these grenades than the RGD-33. The smoke grenade, the RGD-1, is a special grenade. It was available before the war already, and the RGD-1 is a smoke grenade which is a very atypical grenade because this is a smoke grenade which is actually, the model is looking the same as this one, but that's a bit misleading because in reality this had a cardboard cover which made it very lightweight, and that means that it could float on water, so you could also smoke off water, which made it easier to do river crossings when under fire. The smoke grenade was like, if you had to use it as a soldier, you had to take off the cap, and then on the cap there was some kind of a match system, so you could light it, and then it would light like a piece of firework, like you know, when a piece of firework is burning but not really exploding, and then it would burn for a while and then start to produce the smoke. So after deploying it, it would take a while until it would start smoking. The shock troops are 6-man units, very strong, very up-armored, and wearing the steel breastplates. They are actually also looking like Schiesper units, but the engineers in-game are much, much weaker than the shock troops. Well, maybe secretly the Schiesper assault engineers, sapper brigades, are also a bit represented in the shock troops. Which brings us to our next unit, which is a commander unit. It's a doctrinal unit. It's a commissar squad, and the commissar has a nurse here, and it has some guards with SVT-40s, and the commissar itself is here on his knees. Well, let's stand up and walk a bit, commissar. No, here. Yeah, much better. Why are you standing down? Sitting down. Can I make you a detect something. Now let's just take a look at his looks. He has a blue cap, which is typical for political officers. The political officer was almost always present in army units. It was to motivate the troops, to deliver propaganda to the troops, Soviet propaganda, of course. It was to check out if there were any subversive elements within the army, and they had contact with political officers in the NKVD, of course. This guy is armed with a pistol, which most probably is a Mosin Nagant pistol, from the same manufacturers as the rifles, of course. These political commissars were almost always the first ones executed when they were captured by the Wehrmacht, because the soldiers of the Wehrmacht were very wary of the political commissars, because they thought that they were the Bolshevik propaganda machine that they were trying to destroy. So regular soldiers in the Red Army were taken prisoner by the Wehrmacht. Not that that was much better, because then you ended up in a prisoner of war camp, of which the Germans had some, but by far not enough to support all prisoners they took. And out of the 6 million soldiers they took prisoner in World War II, 50% died, and that means that most of them never survived the war while being captive. Okay, I lost a bit of track of the T units, but I have one more T1 unit to talk about, and that's this one. It's the sniper. The sniper has a very classic cap. It's a Bolshevik cap. And the Bolsheviks that were taking power in 1917, they were wearing these. They were wearing these caps while fighting in the Civil War. The snipers in the Soviet Union, they were pretty famous, of course, especially because of some snipers who were racking up kills like it was nothing. But the Soviet sniper, which is armed here with a Mosin Nagant sniper rifle, probably with a PU scope on it, because that's the regular scope on the sniper rifle. The snipers were made famous also by movies like Enemy at the Gates, like I said, but it's a misconception that the sniper in the Soviet Union was a sniper team. It used to be a sniper team in Company of Heroes 2. There used to be a 2-man unit for the snipers. There would be one spotter with a regular rifle and a sniper with a scoped rifle like this one. Maybe that was also taken from Enemy at the Gates, where the sniper, who is the main character of the movie, is also operating in a team of 2. These teams of 2 were only formed after World War II, so that's unrealistic. And actually in this patch where they removed the second person, this unit became more realistic than it was before. The Soviet sniper became more important when regular soldiers were more often equipped with Pepeshka 41s. In late war, there were special. In late war, the Pepeshka became so common that more and more units were purely equipped with Pepeshkas. And not only Pepeshka 41, but also Pepeshka 43, which was even cheaper to produce because it didn't need the wooden stock, but it had a metal stock. Um, the snipers then became extra important because they were the only long-range guys in the units, and they were assigned to units to accompany them and take out targets from a distance. In game, you can also in the campaign you can use incendiary rounds, and the incendiary round is a realistic thing because there were several cartridges that a sniper could use: armor-piercing rounds, incendiary rounds, and tracer rounds. So snipers could fire about 120 shots, and then they would be out of ammo. Most often a sniper would take out one target and then stop. The sniper thing was developed because in the war against the Germans they saw that the Germans had very good sharpshooters, and they stepped up the schooling of designated marksmen, and then they would be called snipers for the Soviet Union. There were some famous Soviet Union snipers. The most famous one is Vasily Zaitsev, of course. That's what the movie is all about. But sniper duty was also open to women, and women like Lyudmila Pavlichenko and Rosa Shanina, they were also very well-known snipers in the Soviet Union, and they racked up over 300 kills each. Rosa Shanina didn't kill so many, but the other woman did. This concludes the part about the Soviet sniper, which brings us to the T2 units. And the first one we're going to take a look at is the M1910 Maxim heavy machine gun. As you can see, the machine gun is on a double-wheeled carrier, and it means that you can drive it around. This one is also infamous because in the Enemy at the Gates movie, this is the machine gun used by the so-called blocking troops to mow down their own soldiers. Again, not true. Well, while walking around, you can just push it around. That's pretty easy. It's not very heavy. It's called the M1910 because 1910 is the year where it was produced. There were several phases in which it was produced, and during the Second World War there were some variations. There was a 250 round belt for it, and if we set it up, let's set up, guys. Okay. Then you can see that the guy is going to lay down behind the Maxim, which is different from the other machine guns that we have seen until now. At least it's different from the Wehrmacht one, because that one was the Lafette, which was standing on a tripod, and this one is just standing on the two-wheel carriage. The M1910 was mounted on a wheeled mount with a gun shield, and in Soviet service it was replaced by the SG-43 Goryunov, and that took over the Maxim production in 1943. So while the Maxim was still produced until the end of the war, this Goryunov would be the main machine gun being produced from like half of the war. Some machine guns had a cap on top of the barrel, and we can see that cap right here. This cap could be opened, and the barrel was used to make this whole thing around the barrel is used to cool the machine gun. The barrel of the machine gun has to be cooled after a while, otherwise you can't fire it anymore because it will be deformed and the weapon will jam. And these things around the barrel here, they were designed for water cooling. Since the Soviet Union is a pretty cold country, especially in wintertime, this cap here was introduced so you could add handfuls of snow and you could pack them into the barrel, and then they would melt while you would fire the gun, and that way the barrel would be kept cool, which is pretty cool if you ask me. The Maxim crew is 6 guys. In reality it would be most of the time it would be 3 guys like the other machine gun crews. 1 shooter, 1 spotter and 1 feeder. And the guys that were standing next to the machine gun here are carrying ammo around their shoulders, as you can see here, ammo belts, and they are wearing ushankas and they are carrying machine gun rifles. This was the most common machine gun when the war started, and there was actually a new machine gun made in the 1930s, and that was the Dushka, and that's the one we can see here.
That looks like a good spot for the MG.
You can see that the Dushka is actually mounted here on a carriage which is similar to the one that the Maxim is on, and that's not what the Dushka was actually meant for. The Dushka was more meant to be set up on a tripod or something like that, so it would be static. And Dushka is actually it was designed by Degtyaryov and Georgy Shpagin. So the name is actually it's Degtyaryova Shpagina Krupnokaliberny, and that means that it's a large caliber gun made by Degtyaryov and Shpagin. This is a heavy infantry machine gun, and it would be deployed with a tripod preferably, but it could also be carried on these 2-wheeled carriages when it was meant to be mobile. So in most defensive cases it would be on the tripod, and on offensive cases it would be more often on the wheeled carriage. Because the designers were Degtyaryov and Shpagin, those names were contrived, and then it was nicknamed the Dushka, because Dushka is an abbreviation for the names, but it also means sweetheart in Russian. So let's deploy the Dushka for a bit. Well, as with the Maxim, you can see that the guy is going to lay down. The box with the cartridge or the box with the belt is next to it. This is much more realistic than the boxes which are hanging in the air on the Wehrmacht machine gun. And this is how the Dushka actually looks in real life, with the six-cornered muzzle brake in front. Apart from the weapon itself, this is not very much different of the Maxim. It has this ability, armor-piercing rounds, and that's because the caliber of the machine gun was bigger, and after the Second World War this machine gun was still used in anti-air abilities. It was also mounted on big vehicles in the World War itself, like the ISU and the IS-2. This brings us to the mortar teams. The mortars are here. This is the PM41 82mm mortar squad, and whoa, my camera is going AWOL. Okay, this is the mortar squad. Like with the other mortar teams that I already talked about, this guy is Superman because he can carry everything by himself. The other guys are wearing cases for mortar shells, and when we set it up,
Let's set this mortar up over there.
yeah, let's set it up over there.
Mortar
Indeed.
displacing.
then we can see that it looks actually the same as all other mortars with the bipod and the mechanism to aim, except that this has a larger crew, which is only for the game, because in reality the crew was 4 guys, and this is a this one has a removable wheelbase, and this wheelbase, the circular wheelbase, was easier to use because when the mortar had to aim at a target which was over there, for example, then you didn't have to totally lift off the base plate. You could just turn it around on the ground because it was circular with a bit of a drill head on the bottom. So it was much easier to deploy it that way. This was the standard sort of light mortar, and the caliber was 82 millimeters, as you can see by the name. 41 was the year it was produced, and it's called the Polewominomet, which means M41, which is the model 41, actually the same way that the Americans were naming their weapons. So despite all differences between the capitalists and the communists, there were also some similarities, and this is one of them. There's also a doctrinal mortar unit. I'll visit that one right now. And this is the HM38 120 millimeter, which is a lot heavier. You can see that it is deployed right now. It also has this circular plate which can turn easily on the ground, and when it sets up, it's being put up on this carriage here. Let's take a look at that. Look, he is driving it to the new location. And then he is going to set it up like this. Mortar bombs from these mortars were super heavy. They could destroy emplacements. The Germans, they were pretty much impressed by the 120 millimeter mortars, so they took them over as soon as they captured them. Because you could set this mortar up pretty quickly. There were batteries used with several of them. They would fire at the target, and then they would move position. So you could hit and run with these heavy mortars, which is pretty cool. So they would like fire on a bunker, for example. They would all fire 2 or 3 shells. Then there was a rain of like 20 to 30 shells on the bunker. The bunker would be dead after that, and then the mortars would relocate to prevent counter fire from enemy artillery. As you can see, it's mounted on a carriage, which also means that the mortar can be drawn by a vehicle. It has a special limber that could be attached to a caisson, and then that would be pulled by a certain vehicle like a truck. Okay, well, let's just put some shells here so we can see it fire. Yeah, this is not super realistic because the guy is just operating the mortar by himself. But we can see that he is adjusting the range and then putting the shell in, and then adjusting the range again. You can see that the screen is shaking because of the heavy explosion, and then he is going to create a shell out of thin air and then put it in the barrel again. Okay, well, that's enough, thank you. These have a 5-man crew. It used to be 6 men as well, but for balance it was reduced to 5, which actually made it less realistic because the real crew of the HM38 120mm was 6 men. Which brings us to the last T2 unit, and that's the AT gun. The AT gun is the ZIS-3 76mm divisional field gun, as you can see in the description. The ZIS gun was a Soviet 76.2mm field gun, and it was a ZIS is a factory designation. It means Zavod imeni Stalina, and that means a factory named after Stalin, which was an honorific title of an artillery factory, and they first produced this gun. You now might think, what? Artillery? This is an AT gun. Yes, it was actually meant as a divisional field artillery gun, and not as an anti-tank weapon. While this was meant to be artillery, it was actually used as an AT gun in the field, because there was much more AT capability needed at that moment than artillery, because there were plenty of other artillery options for the Red Army. Even though Stalin called artillery the god of war, they also needed AT guns, of course. So the ZIS-3 was the successor of the ZIS-2, which is actually the better AT gun of the two. But this one is the one in Company of Heroes. Get the field gun moving. Well, let's get the field gun moving for a bit, because one of the things that the crew members liked about this gun is that it was pretty easy to relocate, as you can see here. Okay, now we're going to set it up, guys, and then we're going to shoot at a target. As with the other AT gun crews, you can see that there's a loader, there's a gunner, and the third guy would be a spotter if he had binoculars. These guys are just standing around with their Mojina guns. And okay, enough of that. As you can see, this also has an ability, and that's the artillery barrage. And that's what it was designed for, actually. And you can see that the barrel is aimed into the sky, and it's functioning as an artillery gun now. How cool is that? This is actually really realistic. What's not so realistic is the crew size. That's one short compared to reality, because there were 7 guys operating this gun. Over 103,000 were produced, and this was a very easy gun to spot for the enemy, actually, because this muzzle brake here that was redirecting some of the exit fumes, and therefore kicking up dust around the gun, so that made it a lot easier to spot from a large distance. At first this gun was produced and then it wasn't tested at all. The army refused to accept the guns without the usual acceptance trials. So because the factory guys wanted to have the gun operational, they just did a demonstration for Stalin, and Stalin said this is a masterpiece of artillery systems design. Stalin really loved his artillery. So then there was an acceptance trial, and immediately accepted in the Red Army as Divisional Field Gun Model 1942, which is the official name for the ZIS-3. So the ZIS-3 later became mounted on several vehicles, and we will talk about that in the next video. On to the next AT gun, which is this one. It's a light AT gun, and it's the M42, and as you might have guessed, this means that it was designed in 1942. The M42 is a 45mm gun. The Red Army actually needed a gun like this for countering scout vehicles, and they were produced with a longer barrel than the previous anti-tank guns, and they also were being designed to be able to take out German armor. But unfortunately, by the time this was finished, the design was finished, and they started rolling out of the factories, the Germans already had produced heavier tanks, and against the heavier tanks of the Panzer IV Ausführung H and up, and also the Panther and the Tiger, of course, this field gun was pretty useless. So this gun, you can see it doesn't have a muzzle brake, so this can conceal itself better, which is portrayed by the camo option in game. And this is another option for the AT gun, a canister shot, which is more of a buckshot with shrapnel in it, and that's again more of a resemblance with an artillery piece. In 1943, the production of the M42 was already lowered again, and then that was replaced in favor of the ZIS-2. In mid-1945, the production ceased. Well, at least the mass production ceased, and by then over almost 11,000 were produced, which is a whole lot if you ask me. So before we go to the artillery units, let's first check out the partisan units, because they are the irregular units of the Red Army in Company of Heroes. We have two partisan troops here. This is the normal partisan troop, and there's also, of course, the partisan tank hunter troop. I forgot about those, but let's put them here. The normal partisan troops are these guys here. Partisans are troops that are operating behind the lines. When the Germans invaded Soviet Union in 1941 in Operation Barbarossa, large parts of the country were overrun. This meant that also large parts of Red Army units were suddenly behind the lines, and they formed units together with civilians that wanted to fight, and local farmers and resistance figures, and they were trying to disrupt the lines for the Germans as much as possible. So they were trying to break supply lines, they were trying to attack convoys on their way to the front, they were trying to get as much ammo and food out of supply depots of the Wehrmacht in order to not make them reach the front. Here you can see an LMG partisan unit, and it has an STG 44, which means that that was captured of the Wehrmacht soldiers, of course. This is somewhat realistic because partisans had to make do with what they could find, and if they would encounter units, then they would capture weapons, of course, but it's much more common that they would capture Kar 98s or MP40s, because those weapons were much more common than the STG 44. There's also a tank hunter unit which has the famous Panzerschreck, and that's really rare. So the chance that a partisan would be able to capture a weapon like that is very slim. There were several fronts in the Soviet Union, and in Ukraine there were at the start of the war there were about 30,000 partisans, but the Germans, they had a lot of anti-partisan expeditions there, and they took a whole lot of them prisoner, and if you were taken prisoner as a partisan, then you would be hanged almost immediately, because the Germans had no mercy for partisans. Partisans were just treated the same as political commissars, Jews, gypsies, and other subversive elements according to the Nazi ideology. In Belarus, there were about 7,000 partisans at the beginning of the war, and in Belarus the partisan movement was one of the most successful, growing to over 50,000 partisans in the second half of the war. So the partisans lived in the forests. The models that you can see here are based off of pictures of partisans, and that's also something that you have to take take into consideration. Partisans were hanged as soon as they were arrested, so pictures of partisans are really rare. And on a lot of pictures they just look like regular soldiers most of the time, because they actually were soldiers. Pictures like these with men like these, sometimes they are staged. Make sure that if you see a picture of partisans, that you make sure that they're not staged and that they're actually depicting real men fighting in real partisan units out of forests, like for example the Bryansk forest, which is also featured in a map in Company of Heroes. Okay, this brings us to our last two units, the artillery units. This is the ML20-152 gun howitzer. This is the most common artillery piece in the Red Army. The crew in game consists of 4 guys, as you can see here. This is not realistic, because in reality they were 5, but overall this weapon is depicted pretty realistically. It's called the 152mm howitzer gun M1937 because it was produced from 1937 to 1947, and almost 7,000 of these were built. This artillery piece could fire in super long ranges, and let's see how that goes if we let it fire on this spot here. First they will rotate the gun, which is not done by 2 people in reality because it's super heavy. The weight of the gun in combat was over 7,000 kilos, so you can imagine that it's impossible to replace that with 2 guys. Okay, a loader and a gunner. Spotting had to be done in the distance, like with all other artillery pieces, and this artillery piece was a successor of the siege gun M1910, which was pretty successful in the Imperial Russian era. And in 1937 there was the first test of the M1937 ML20. There was another one also in test, the ML15, but because that had some drawbacks, the ML20 was mass-produced after they cleared out some defects in, especially in the carriage system, so the base where the gun was put on. The ML20 had therefore the better carriage, and even though it was heavier, it was mass-produced in favor of the ML15. The ML20 was actually intended for corps artillery, but they formed battalions of ML20, and then they would mass artillery a target, and then after the artillery barrage was over, they could try and move not as fast as the HM mortars, of course, but they would especially be used against fortifications, of course, and against key objects in the near rear. Okay, so this brings us to our last piece of artillery, which is the B4 203mm howitzer. This one has several nicknames. The Germans called it Stalin's sledgehammer, and the Finns called it the Karelia sculptor. This because it was used against Finland on the Karelian front. It totally devastated all bunkers there, and the concrete and iron was made into new shapes, which then led to the Karelian sculptor thing. If we let it fire here, for example, then we can see that it's also turning, but it's slower because it's much heavier than the ML20, but it has a tracked carriage, as you can see, so it could be deployed behind vehicles. The barrel is raised for firing, and they all close their ears because the shells are super large, as you can see here. And because the shells were so large, it was called Stalin's sledgehammer by the Germans, because one of those shells was 100 kilograms. So one of those shells would hit your target, and then your target would be history. There's also, as you can see here, a direct fire attack ability. And direct fire was actually not meant for the B4 howitzer, but in history there was a captain called Ivan Vetmedenko, and he became a hero of the Soviet Union because he was direct firing against enemy troops with this B4 howitzer, and he apparently did it so well that he got this title. So the B4 howitzer is one of the heaviest howitzers in the war, and its weight was 17,700 kilos, which is more than twice as heavy as the ML20, and there were almost 900 of them built, and the Soviet Union flattened a whole lot of targets with the heavy 203mm shells. This concludes our video about the Red Army units when it comes to infantry and team weapons. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have anything to comment, if you have any questions, please just post them in the comments. Next time we will talk about Red Army units when it comes to vehicles, light vehicles and tanks. So I hope I'll see you then. That's it for this time. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching and have a nice day.